Clinking crystal champagne flutes stopped the moment Victoria Harrington pointed her manicured finger at her daughter-in-law's left hand. "Is that copper?" She sneered as the Newport elite erupted into cruel laughter. They thought Vivian was a penniless nobody. They didn't hear the Black Hawk helicopters landing outside. To the outside world, the Harringtons were American royalty. They were a family, forged in New England, steel railroad money, and generational real estate empires that stretched from Boston to Manhattan. To marry into the Harrington family was to ascend to a level of wealth where the air was thinner, the expectations were crushing, and the judgments were absolute. And Nathaniel Harrington, the eldest son and primary heir to the billion-dollar dynasty, was supposed to marry a senator's daughter. He was supposed to marry someone who understood the tactical deployment of a charity gala and the importance of a Tiffany diamond. Instead, he came back from a 2-year business expansion trip in London with Vivienne. Vivienne did not fit the mold. She possessed a quiet, understated beauty with wavy chestnut hair. She often tied back with a simple velvet ribbon and a wardrobe composed of sensible wool coats and vintage dresses. She was an art restorer, an orphan raised by a reclusive grandmother in the misty hills of the Scottish borders. She didn't own a single designer handbag, had never attended a Swiss boarding school, and her social footprint was entirely non-existent. But worst of all, in the eyes of Nathaniel's mother, Victoria Harrington, was the ring. When Nathaniel officially introduced Vivienne to the family at their sprawling Newport, Rhode Island estate, Victoria's sharp eyes immediately dropped to the girl's left ring finger. What she saw there sent a shockwave of absolute horror through her system. It was a dull, asymmetrical band that looked like tarnished silver or perhaps deeply aged pewter. Sitting flush in the center of the dark metal was a small, raw, deeply flawed red stone that looked more like a piece of hardened glass than a ruby. There were faint, almost entirely eroded scratches along the band that vaguely resembled an engraving, but to the untrained eye, it looked like something a teenager might buy for $20 at a roadside antique stall. "Nathaniel, darling," Victoria had gasped during that first meeting, pulling her son into the hallway while Vivian was admiring a portrait in the study. "What is that on her hand? Tell me it is a joke. Tell me the real ring, the Harrington 6-carat emerald cut, is being resized." Nathaniel's jaw had tightened. "The Harrington diamond stays in the vault, Mother. Vivian didn't want it. She wanted this one. It's, a family piece, from her side." Victoria had let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Her side? She has no side. She's an art restorer who lives in a flat in Camden. Nathaniel, people will think you've been cut off. They will think we've gone bankrupt. It looks like a Cracker Jack toy, despite the family's intense opposition, and his father Reginald's thinly veiled threats to restructure the family trust. Nathaniel married Vivian in a tiny private ceremony in London. The Harringtons did not attend. Now, 2 years later, Vivienne and Nathaniel were forced to return to the Lion's Den. Reginald Harrington was turning 70, and his birthday was to be celebrated with a social event of the season at their Newport mansion, the Breakers. Hundreds of the East Coast elite were invited. Politicians, hedge fund billionaires, and old money matriarchs were all descending upon the coastal estate. And Vivian, the charity casewife, was forced to attend. From the moment she arrived, the psychological warfare began. Nathaniel's younger sister, Caroline, made it her personal mission to ensure Vivian felt as small as possible. Caroline was engaged to Preston, a ruthless venture capitalist, and proudly wore a flawless 10-carat platinum diamond ring that practically blinded anyone in a 10-foot radius. "Oh, Vivian, you're so brave," Caroline loudly declared on the veranda the afternoon before the party, ensuring a group of visiting socialites could hear her, wearing that rustic little piece in front of everyone. "It's so bohemian." "I told Preston, I said, not everyone needs a diamond. Some people are just happy with, well, whatever that is. It's an heirloom," Caroline Vivian said softly, her thumb gently brushing the rough edge of the dark red stone. "Of course it is." Caroline smirked, sipping her mimosa. "Did your grandmother find it in a thrift shop in Glasgow? I know an excellent jeweler in Manhattan, Viv. He's very discreet. He could swap that murky red pebble for a nice lab-grown ruby. Nobody would know the difference, and you wouldn't have to hide your hand in your pockets all evening. Vivienne just smiled, a serene, unshakable expression that always infuriated the Harringtons. "I'm quite fond of this pebble, Caroline. But thank you for the concern." Nathaniel, returning with 2 glasses of iced tea, caught the tail end of the exchange. He wrapped a protective arm around his wife's waist. "Leave it alone, Caroline. The ring stays." But the harassment didn't stop there. Throughout the weekend, Vivienne was subjected to endless whispers and sideways glances. Maids intentionally spilled water near her plate, assuming she was of no importance. Reginald Harrington loudly lamented to his golf partners that his son had been brainwashed by a peasant. Through it all, Vivienne remained impeccably polite, observing the staggering wealth and venomous snobbery with the detached fascination of a historian studying a doomed empire. She never raised her voice. She never snapped back. She simply wore her tarnished little ring, waiting for the evening of the grand dinner. The night of Reginald's 70th birthday was a spectacle of obscene extravagance. The grand ballroom of the Newport estate had been transformed to resemble the Palace of Versailles. Chandeliers dripping with Swarovski crystals, illuminated tables covered in rare white orchids, and antique sterling silver cutlery. Over 200 guests, the absolute pinnacle of American high society, took their seats in a flurry of rustling silk and heavy cologne. Vivienne and Nathaniel were seated near the head of the table, though noticeably pushed slightly down the hierarchy, closer to the governor of Rhode Island than to the family matriarch. Dinner proceeded in a grueling marathon of 7 courses featuring butter-poached Maine lobster truffles imported from Piedmont and vintage Bordeaux that cost more than an average family's home. The atmosphere was thick with the suffocating hum of old money back-patting itself. When the dessert, a gold leaf-encrusted chocolate dome, was served, Victoria Harrington stood up and tapped her spoon against her crystal flute. The massive room fell into a respectful silence. Family, friends, distinguished guests. Victoria began, her voice amplified by the perfect acoustics of the arched ceiling. "We are gathered here to celebrate my wonderful husband Reginald, a man who built his legacy from the ground up, ensuring the Harrington name remains synonymous with excellence, tradition, and uncompromising standards." Applause echoed through the room. Victoria smiled, her eyes drifting down the table. A malicious spark ignited in her gaze as she zeroed in on Vivienne. "Of course, we are also a family that embraces modern changes." Victoria continued, her tone dripping with saccharine poison. "Many of you have not formally met my eldest son's new bride, Vivienne. She comes to us all the way from a quaint little life in England. Stand up, darling. Let everyone see you." Nathaniel stiffened, his hand gripping Vivienne's thigh beneath the table. "Mother, don't," he muttered loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear, but Vivienne gracefully stood. She wore a simple, elegant midnight blue silk dress, en couture, unlabeled but fitting her perfectly. She offered a polite, dignified nod to the room. "Yes, Vivienne brings such a humbling perspective to our family," Victoria projected to the crowd walking slowly around the head table. "In fact, she is a stark reminder that true love doesn't require standard luxuries. Why, just look at her engagement ring. Show them, Vivienne. Hold up your hand." The room went dead silent. The humiliation was calculated, orchestrated to publicly shame Nathaniel for his choice and force Vivienne into submission. "Mother, that is enough," Nathaniel said, standing up, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor. "Nonsense," Nathaniel Reginald boomed from the head of the table, his face flushed with wine. "It's a beautiful sentiment. Your mother is just pointing out how frugal your bride is. It's quite amusing. A Harrington heir proposing with a piece of tin and a cloudy piece of sea glass. It shows character, even if it looks like it came from a gumball machine." Scattered chuckles rippled through the ballroom. Caroline, sitting across the table, leaned forward, her massive diamond catching the light. "Tell us the story of the ring, Vivienne. Really, we're all dying to know. What century was the tin mined?" And more laughter. cruel, biting upper-crust laughter. Senator Hayes chuckled, and the CEO of a major tech conglomerate whispered something to his wife behind his napkin. Vivienne did not sit down. She did not cry, nor did she flee the room in embarrassment. Instead, she raised her left hand, allowing the dull, dark ring to catch the light of the massive chandeliers. "It is not tin, Caroline," Vivienne said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable, chilling authority that instantly silenced the chuckles. "It is an alloy of meteoritic iron and Welsh gold forged in the late 15th century. And the stone is not a ruby, nor is it sea glass. It is a raw, unpolished black prince's spinel." The room remained silent, confused by the technical terminology. Victoria scoffed loudly. "Meteoritic iron spinel. It sounds like you're making up fairy tales to make a cheap bauble sound important." "I don't need to make it sound important, Victoria." Vivienne replied calmly, using her mother-in-law's first name, a massive breach of Harrington protocol. "It is important because of the seal carved into the underside of the band. A seal that hasn't been worn in public for nearly 300 years. Before Victoria could unleash her wrath at the sheer disrespect, a strange sound began to penetrate the thick, soundproofed walls of the Newport mansion. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping vibrating the crystal glasses on the tables. Thwoop, thwoop, thwoop. "What on earth is that?" Reginald demanded, looking toward the heavy velvet curtains covering the French doors. The thumping grew deafening. It was the undeniable sound of heavy rotor blades. Helicopters. And not the small, sleek civilian choppers the Harringtons chartered for trips to the Hamptons. These were massive military-grade engines, shaking the very foundation of the breakers. Suddenly, the grand mahogany double doors of the ballroom burst open. The Harrington estate's head of private security, a former Navy SEAL named Harrison, stumbled into the room, looking utterly bewildered and pale. "Mr. Harrington's right. I couldn't stop them. They breached the main gate. They overrode our systems." "Who?" Reginald roared, his face turning purple. "Call the state police. I have the governor sitting at my table." "Sir, the state police are escorting them," Harrison stammered. Before Reginald could speak again, a synchronized, heavy rhythm of boots, marching on marble, echoed from the grand foyer. The elite guests watched in stunned silence as a dozen men filed into the ballroom. They were not American police. Half of them wore immaculate, sharply tailored black suits, with subtle earpieces moving with the lethal, silent grace of elite intelligence operatives. But it was the other half that made the breath catch in the throats of everyone present. They wore the unmistakable brilliant scarlet tunics, dark blue trousers with red stripes, and white buff belts. Although they weren't wearing the ceremonial bearskin hats, their military dress uniforms were instantly recognizable to anyone who had ever seen a television screen. They were the elite infantry of the British Armed Forces, the Queen's, now the King's Guard. At the center of the formation walked an older, deeply distinguished man with silver hair, wearing the ceremonial dress of the Lord Chamberlain of the royal household. He carried no weapon, but in his white-gloved hands he held an ancient, heavily reinforced mahogany lockbox adorned with a solid gold crest. The Lord Chamberlain halted perfectly at the center of the ballroom. The heavily armed operatives fanned out, securing all exits in seconds. The silence in the room was so absolute one could hear the wax dripping from the chandeliers. Victoria Harrington's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. Reginald was frozen in his chair. The Lord Chamberlain's sharp blue eyes swept over the sea of bewildered billionaires and politicians, ignoring their wealth entirely, until his gaze landed on the woman in the midnight blue dress standing near the head table. He took 3 precise steps forward, bowed deeply from the waist, and spoke in a crisp, resounding aristocratic English accent that shattered the Harrington family's reality forever. "Lady Vivienne of the House of Stuart," the Lord Chamberlain announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The Crown graciously begs your pardon for the intrusion, but Her Majesty's archives have officially authenticated the signet ring upon your hand. He held out the mahogany box. "We have come to deliver the rest of your inheritance." The grand ballroom of the Newport estate was so utterly devoid of sound that the distant rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves against the Rhode Island cliffs suddenly felt deafening. Over 200 of America's most powerful tycoons, elite politicians, and generational socialites were trapped in a state of collective breathless paralysis. They stared in absolute shock at the military detachment that had just seamlessly invaded the undisputed pinnacle of East Coast high society. At the center of the chaotic tableau stood Vivian. She did not gasp. She did not stagger backwards in surprise. Her posture remained as flawless and resolute as a sovereign monarch receiving a foreign dignitary on her own soil. Only Nathaniel, whose hand was still resting fiercely and protectively near her waist, felt the incredibly slight tremor in her breath. He had always known his wife's lineage was deeply ancient and remarkably complex, completely shrouded in the misty histories of the Scottish Highlands. However, he had never, in his wildest dreams, anticipated the full, overwhelming deployment of the British Crown's most elite security apparatus right into his father's dining room. Lord Frederick Cavendish, the reigning Lord Chamberlain of the royal household, stepped forward. His white-gloved hands maintained a vice-like reverent grip on the heavily reinforced ancient mahogany lockbox. The solid gold crest of the British monarch gleamed fiercely under the dazzling light of the Swarovski crystal chandeliers. For exactly 278 years, Lord Cavendish began his booming, impeccably cultivated baritone commanding every square inch of the vast room, the Crown estate operating in strict, highly classified conjunction with the private banking institution Coutts and Company has meticulously guarded a sovereign trust. This specific trust was placed into absolute irrevocable escrow following the catastrophic Jacobite risings of 1745. It was mandated by royal decree that these unfathomable assets would only ever be released when a direct, biologically undisputed female heir of the primary Stuart bloodline stepped forward. An heir who could present the lost, legendary signet of King James II, the exact ring you have so publicly and undeniably authenticated this evening, Lady Vivian. Victoria Harrington, whose face had completely drained of all human color until it flawlessly matched the shade of the imported white orchids adorning her tables, finally found her voice. It was a pathetic, highly pitched, terrified squeak. "Stuart, lady." "What? This is absolutely absurd. She restores old dusty paintings in a damp basement. She is a nobody, Nathaniel. I demand you tell these paid actors to leave our private home immediately." One of the elite intelligence operatives standing near the door, dressed in an immaculate, sharply tailored black suit, turned his head just a fraction of an inch, locking his cold eyes directly with Victoria's. The sheer, unadulterated, lethal menace radiating from his gaze snapped her jaw shut instantly. "The ring you so loudly mocked as a piece of gumball machine tin, Madam Lord Cavendish," continued, his tone absolutely laced with a razor-sharp, freezing, aristocratic disdain, "is scientifically forged from fragments of the Gibeon meteorite combined with pure, unalloyed Welsh gold. It remains the oldest continuous royal seal currently existing in the British Isles, and it is the singular, legally binding key to an inheritance that fundamentally dwarfs the combined, leveraged net worth of every single individual currently seated within this room." With a synchronized, terrifyingly sharp click, the two armed royal guards flanking the Lord Chamberlain stepped back, locking their boots together and securing the immediate perimeter. Lord Cavendish produced a small, heavily oxidized antique iron key from his tailored silk waistcoat pocket. He smoothly inserted it into the heavy, intricate gold lock of the mahogany box, turning it with a heavy mechanical clunk. The thick lid creaked open, revealing the dark interior. A collective, entirely involuntary gasp violently rippled through the sea of billionaires. Caroline Harrington, who had spent the entire weekend obnoxiously flaunting her 10-carat platinum diamond ring, physically shrank back into her velvet-lined chair. In the presence of true history, she suddenly became hyper-aware of how deeply insignificant and incredibly tacky her modern jewelry truly was. Resting majestically on a bed of faded, centuries-old crimson velvet were the incredibly legendary, long-lost Stuart shadow jewels. At the absolute center sat a staggering, utterly breathtaking tiara, crafted entirely of flawless pigeon-blood Burmese rubies and colossal rose-cut diamonds that radiated a blinding, fiery brilliance across the room. Beside the tiara lay a heavy, magnificent platinum collar, completely dripping with perfect, teardrop-shaped cerulean sapphires the size of robin's eggs. Tucked into the corners were a pair of massive, cascading diamond chandelier earrings that had once framed the face of Mary of Modena herself. By the direct, legally binding authority of King Charles III, Lord Cavendish declared, his voice echoing with centuries of unwavering tradition and thoroughly verified by the highest constitutional courts of the United Kingdom, "You are hereby officially recognized as Lady Vivian Stuart, the Duchess of Rothesay's Shadow Estate." The historical properties, the vast land holdings covering roughly 42,000 acres of the pristine Scottish Highlands, the private, undocumented art collections currently held in the subterranean vaults of the British Museum, and the massive accumulated sovereign wealth fund, managed exclusively by Coots, are hereby legally and permanently transferred into your total unilateral control. Reginald Harrington, a terrifying man who had spent his entire ruthless 70 years bullying weaker competitors into immediate submission, suddenly began to hyperventilate. He desperately clutched his chest, his mind frantically attempting to calculate the sheer, apocalyptic financial scale of what was unfolding before his eyes. The quiet woman he had spent the last 48 hours actively degrading, attempting to systematically humiliate into divorcing his eldest son, was not just a secret billionaire. She was a recognized sovereign entity. She represented old money in a way the Harrington family couldn't even begin to comprehend or accurately measure. The Harringtons had built rudimentary steel railroads in the late 1800s. Vivienne's direct ancestors had fiercely ruled entire European nations throughout the Middle Ages. Furthermore, Lord Cavendish added his sharp blue eyes, narrowing slightly as he looked directly at the sweating patriarch. The crown historically takes a very dim, highly litigious view of its recognized noble daughters being subjected to intentional public degradation. The true, devastating masterstroke of Vivienne's historical revenge, however, was not the breathtaking display of the glittering royal jewels. It was the crushing, completely unavoidable reality of global high finance that was about to permanently obliterate the Harrington dynasty from the face of the earth. Vivienne turned gracefully to Lord Cavendish, her face a mask of absolute serenity. "Frederick, have the highly sensitive finalized financial documents regarding the Harrington Enterprise holdings been processed by the London desk, as I explicitly requested? They were fully ratified and legally sealed exactly 40 minutes ago, Your Grace," the Lord Chamberlain replied respectfully. He reached into his luxurious leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of heavy vellum paper, securely sealed with the dark red wax of the Royal Bank. Reginald's head snapped up violently, a freezing, cold sweat rapidly breaking out across his deeply lined forehead. "What documents? What does my company have to do with any of this nonsense?" Vivienne looked down at her father-in-law, her beautiful eyes completely devoid of any remaining pity. "Did you honestly think I didn't know Reginald I am an art restorer? Yes? My entire life's work revolves around paying meticulous, obsessive attention to the absolute smallest details. I look for the hidden cracks beneath the pristine surface. I knew the Harrington commercial real estate empire has been massively, dangerously over-leveraged for the past 4 consecutive years. I know for a fact you quietly lost over $3.5 billion in the downtown commercial sector crash last winter. And I know that you have been desperately, secretly seeking a massive European financial bailout to avoid filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of this current fiscal quarter." Shocked, horrified whispers erupted across the massive ballroom like a sudden wildfire. The elite senators and ruthless hedge fund managers, the exact same men who had just been loudly toasting Reginald's legendary business acumen, were suddenly staring at him with the horrified, terrified disgust reserved for a highly infectious, deadly disease. In their extremely cutthroat world, verbal cruelty was perfectly acceptable, but impending bankruptcy was an unforgivable, contagious sin. You illegally hacked our private corporate servers," Reginald sputtered desperately, his face turning an alarming, dangerous shade of purple. "That is highly confidential encrypted corporate data. I will have the federal authorities arrest you for corporate espionage immediately." "She didn't need to hack a single thing," Reginald Nathaniel interrupted, his voice echoing with absolute profound disgust as he stared at the man who raised him. "I personally saw the internal ledgers. I saw the systemic rot. Why on earth do you think I spent 2 grueling years working out of London? I was desperately trying to find a massive private equity firm willing to structure a quiet, complex bailout to save our family name from total, catastrophic public ruin." Vivienne gently reached into the mahogany box, softly touching the ancient, incredibly heavy ruby tiara, running her slender finger along the priceless, blood-red stones. "Nathaniel worked tirelessly to save you from your own greed. He successfully negotiated a highly complex, multi-billion-dollar liquidity bridge with an anonymous, heavily protected European sovereign wealth fund. A specific, highly exclusive fund managed solely by Coutts and Company. A fund that, as of tonight, I completely and legally control." The heavy silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and utterly deafening. It was the unmistakable, terrifying sound of a massive empire collapsing instantly into ash. Victoria let out a horrified, strangled, incredibly ugly gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Reginald desperately clutched the sharp edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark bone-white as the horrifying, inescapable reality finally crashed down upon him. The shadowy, mysterious European benefactors who held the absolute, indisputable fate of his entire legacy in their hands was the exact same woman he had just publicly mocked as a penniless, pathetic peasant. As the sole legally recognized controller of the Stuart Sovereign Trust, Vivienne continued, her perfectly modulated voice echoing flawlessly in the dead silence of the room. "I have the absolute unilateral authority to immediately finalize the massive liquidity transfer, essentially saving your corrupt company from defaulting on its massive loans. Or I can simply instruct Coates to withdraw the bailout offer entirely, forcing the Harrington Corporation into immediate, highly publicized, devastating liquidation." Reginald Harrington, a man built entirely of terrifying pride and ruthless ego, did the only thing he possibly could in that devastating moment. He completely broke. He slid out of his antique, velvet-lined dining chair and fell heavily to his knees on the freezing marble floor. The proud, untouchable patriarch of the American elite was openly sobbing. "Vivienne, please," Reginald begged pathetically, holding his shaking hands up in a desperate, broken plea. "I am begging you. It's over 100 years of family history. It's our entire legacy. We will lose the houses, the private jets, the social status. I will be completely ruined. Please forgive us. We honestly didn't know who you were." "That is exactly the point, Reginald," Vivienne said softly, looking down at him with a chilling, absolute calm. "Oh, you didn't know who I was, and so you treated me like complete garbage. You only respect raw power, vast money, and aristocratic titles. You miserably failed the absolute simplest test of basic human decency. You proved to everyone here that beneath the incredibly expensive tailored suits and the imported caviar, you are utterly, completely bankrupt of character." She turned back to Lord Cavendish, who was waiting patiently. "Kill the deal. Instruct the London desk to withdraw all offers of financial support immediately. Let them face their angry creditors at the opening bell on Monday morning." "With immense pleasure, Your Grace," the Lord Chamberlain said simply, typing a rapid final command into his highly secured, encrypted digital tablet. Victoria screamed a harrowing guttural sound of pure unadulterated despair, collapsing dramatically over the table and shattering several expensive crystal glasses. Caroline was loudly hyperventilating, aggressively, screaming at her suddenly fleeing fiancé to come back. But Preston was already sprinting for the exit. The elite guests were already standing up in a frantic panic, completely abandoning their expensive half-eaten lobster dinners, frantically pulling out their phones to call their private brokers and aggressively short Harrington's stock before the market opened. The terrifying social contagion of being physically associated with a doomed, bankrupt family was spreading instantly. Vivienne did not stay to watch the final, pathetic death throes of the Harrington dynasty. She simply turned to her loyal husband, who was watching his toxic, abusive family spectacularly self-destruct, with a look of profound, deeply exhausted relief. "Are you ready to go home, Nathaniel?" she asked softly, offering him her hand, the left hand wearing the absolute most powerful, historically significant ring in the entire world. Nathaniel took it firmly, tightly, lacing his fingers through hers. "I have never been more ready." Surrounded by the heavily armed M-6 operatives and the towering, immaculate royal guards in their brilliant scarlet tunics, the new Duchess of Rothesay and her husband walked proudly out of the grand Versailles-inspired ballroom. They stepped out into the cool, salty night air of Rhode Island, leaving the completely ruined, utterly devastated remains of the Harrington family weeping uncontrollably among the crushed white orchids and spilled vintage champagne. Outside, the massive Black Hawk helicopters waited, their heavy rotors spinning up to ferry the royal couple to a waiting private jet. The true queen had reclaimed her rightful throne, and she had effectively burned the false, arrogant kings to the ground on her way out. What an absolutely incredible tale of karma and hidden royalty. Vivienne proved that true class and power whisper while fragile arrogance screams. The Harrington family finally learned the ultimate lesson: never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover hides centuries of sovereign wealth. Did you love this devastatingly satisfying revenge story? Please hit that like button. Right now, share this video with your friends who love drama. And subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life stories.